Okay, good afternoon and thanks for coming. Definitely a huge shout out to my SLP family that really came to support after listening to 3 hours of presentations this morning. I am going to talk to you about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, as it's something that I spent a lot of time working on in my last school environment, and that is social emotional learning for high school students, and specifically reframing what we talk about when we think about grit for high school students. Now, when I was starting to put this presentation together, I was thinking about what is this great statistic I'm going to share, a really moving quote that would really ground the conversation. And I found a couple, some that I'll come to throughout the course of the presentation, but I really came back to my students, because ultimately they are who ground me, they are the people who motivate me and keep me going, and why this work is so important to me. So I just wanted to share some photos of some of the moments that were most precious during my time as a teacher. Now, I started my career in education, like many people, through Teach for America. I joined right out of undergrad because I really was disheartened by the inequity I saw for opportunities, specifically for low-income students of color. And when I joined Teach for America, I was really interested in being a secondary corps member because of my lived experience with friends, family who didn't persist through college. And I really felt that being a corps member and teaching high school would give me the opportunity to figure out why students don't make it through college. Throughout my years in Teach for America, I was placed in Chicago. I taught high school chemistry, and the data that I saw kind of just highlighted this problem even more. So in 2014, I was wrapping up my core experience, and Chicago Tribune published an article about how college attainment was on the rise. Unfortunately, that meant that still only 14 out of 100 CPS freshmen were expected to get a four-year degree by their mid-20s, which is lower than the national average, which is a whopping 18. This is even more problematic for Black and brown students. In Chicago, Latino females have the highest chance of getting a college degree, with only about 16% of them receiving their bachelor's within 6 years. And for African American males, that number is at about 6%. That woke me up a little bit, and it startled me. And it really made me realize that just being the best chemistry teacher that I could be wasn't enough, and I had to do more. But I kind of felt good about it. I was working at this high-performing charter school. We had all of the autonomy in the world. We had the great systems in place. We didn't have the bureaucracy of CPS, so we must be doing better, is what I thought. But we weren't really, right? So our data for our first 5 classes, we had only about 33% of our students persisting through college. And so I was left with, what's the answer, right? I feel like I'm doing a lot of great things in my classroom. I know I'm putting a lot of time into preparing great lessons and introducing really rigorous academic content, but there has to be another piece to this puzzle. And it was right around this time that this idea of grit became the buzzword in education. And everyone started to think about grit as this key to solving these college persistence data that we saw in charters, but also in public schools. And I jumped on that bandwagon real quick, right? So Angela Duckworth was one of the pioneers of this work, and I remember watching her TED Talk during my second year, and she described grit as having a passion for a goal that you can stick with for a long time. And she says that with her students, she described it as doing something, even when you may not feel like doing it at that moment, because it'll help you achieve the big goals you want most. This sounded like a great idea, right? Grit was this one thing that I could locate and really explicitly teach and develop in students. And I wasn't alone in that. Ed reformers all around kind of grappled with how they could instill grit in students and in schools. You could now find countless articles about it. People wrote books about it. At charters and public schools and across the nation, they began to invest in how can we make pre and post tests to measure grit in students and whether they're working towards that gritty character trait. And at the time, that felt like a really great idea. This is something that's going to solve all of that troubling data that I wasn't okay with. But it was kind of in my last year, before I moved into taking over our advisory curriculum, that I realized that I had to reframe my definition of grit. And so I want to kind of propose to you 2 different reasons why you should think about grit as more than just persevere through difficult times. And this was particularly true for me in Chicago. I realized that students don't need another test, period. And the last thing they need is another test to just prove to me that they are developing resilience. And given our context in Chicago, where these are the headlines that students wake up to pretty much on a daily basis, the fact that they come to school every day ready to learn shows me that they have grit. The second thing, and the thing that took me a little bit longer to wrestle with, is the idea that simply teaching grit is just disguising bootstrapping. And it blames youth for failing in systems that were already designed to marginalize them, and it essentially blocked their success. And this was particularly hard for me as a child of immigrants, when my parents absolutely pushed this narrative of just work hard and you'll get there. And I had to do a lot of work around learning about these systems that were systematically failing students of color. And so when I thought about it, I needed some data. I had to look into some numbers, being a science person, to really kind of figure out, like, well, that can't be true. If kids work hard, they're going to make it. And I remember in the summer going into my last year, I saw this cartoon, maybe some of you have seen it before, that really gave me a good visual for why it's problematic for me to tell students to just work hard. Specifically this last box where you kind of can't see the little guy in the corner, but he's saying, look, if I got up here myself, why can't you? That is what we are telling students that they need to do when we just tell them, be gritty. I also had to get some numbers. And so in 2014, the Washington Post published this study. I actually didn't find it till a little bit later. But essentially it summed up that even poor kids who do everything right still don't do much better than rich kids who do everything wrong. And so a poor college grad has pretty much equal percent chance as a rich high school dropout of ending up in the bottom 20% of their income quartile by the age of 40. Whereas a rich high school dropout has about 14% chance of ending up in the top 80 to 100% income quartile. Okay? So again, I had to really reframe what I was teaching students in advisory and in class when I was just saying, hey, you just need to persevere. Hey, you just need to be gritty to make it. So what did I do? I realized that I need to help students, particularly low-income students, perform in systems that are set up to fail them. But just pushing grit as the sole way out wasn't really going to help them. It wasn't going to help them in the future. It was just helping them adapt to systems of inequality. Instead, what I need to do is I need to help students actually be ready to change systems when they are not with me anymore. And rather than learn how to simply adapt, I need to teach them how to deconstruct. So with my school, I had the opportunity to work on creating an advisory curriculum. And I think this is work that a lot of people put time into, and I just had the opportunity to be a part of it. But rather than just thinking about grit and lessons on perseverance, we realized that there were a lot of other things that needed to be added to social emotional learning for high school students. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are some of the major things that we focused on to move the conversation past perseverance. So some of them are around kind of what you can imagine, like goal setting, passions and interests, and career knowledge. But there are also things about owning your own story and realizing where you come from. There are lessons and weeks where we talk about systems of power and privilege. There are also opportunities for students to figure out how they can build positive networks and identify social supports when they are no longer in the walls of our school. Most importantly, though, and the one that I bolded, because I think it's the one that I want to do even better when I return to this work in Chicago, is learn how to, or teach kids how to use these tools in the context of their community. Because ultimately, the goal is to use these skills not just to move up and move out, but to actually help change the systems that are set up to hold students of color back. My last point, and my last, I guess, push to you all in terms of thinking about grit, is think about you and your role as an educator and what you're doing to better yourself. So one of my biggest pushes and reasons why I got into school leadership is because I think that education is obviously a people business, but we also need to be focused on making ourselves the best version of who we are. And if you are not actively engaged in that work yourself, you kind of don't have any business helping kids become better people. And so what that means for you is to be very open about your own strengths and weaknesses, be vulnerable with your students, but most importantly, be ready to engage in the same personal growth and learning that you are expecting students to do on a daily basis. And so this was one of the quotes that stuck with me that I thought I was going to start this talk with, but I decided to end with it. And it's because I am going back to Chicago. I am going back to the high expectations charter that has a lot of systems and rules and routines. But this is something that I want to keep in mind as I go through my day-to-day and when I interact with students. And that is that if eye contact needs to be made, prepare students to stare power in the eyes and unapologetically demand justice. Thank you.